So, I'm very pleased to welcome Adrian Doff as today's presenter. Co-author of Cambridge English in Power, Adrian has worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in Finland, in the former Yugoslavia, in Britain, Lebanon and Egypt. He's co-author of Meanings into Words and the Language in Use series, author of the teacher training course Teach English, series editor of Cambridge Skills for Fluency, and co-author of Listening 1, 2 and 4 in the Cambridge Skills for Fluency series as well. He's one of the authors of Cambridge English Unlimited and also, as I mentioned, Cambridge English in Power. He's currently living in Germany and working as a freelance teacher and teacher trainer. And today's webinar is another chance to hear Adrian's talk from earlier on this year on speaking skills. So we're delighted to have him back. Welcome, Adrian. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alistair. Hello everybody and welcome, and thank you for tuning into this webinar. As you just heard, I'm speaking from Munich in Germany on what is, I have to say, a rather chilly and cloudy afternoon. So I hope the weather's better, at least for some of you, where you are. The focus of this seminar is speaking skills and speaking generally. And as teachers, we tend to spend, I think, quite a lot of time. We attach quite a lot of importance to speaking in the classroom, often doing activities such as these, discussion, role play, games, telling stories and anecdotes, getting learners to talk about personal experiences. And activities of these kinds are an opportunity for learners to speak. They give practice in speaking. And I think to a certain extent, we can develop learners' speaking skills simply by giving them opportunities to speak or giving them practice in speaking. In other words, you can get better at speaking simply by speaking. But in this webinar, I'd like to focus really on the question of how we can actually improve speaking skills rather than simply giving practice in speaking and opportunities to speak. And I think there are two aspects to this, which is to do with what speaking skills involve. On the one hand, is to do with language and what language we need in order to speak well. And another aspect is the process of developing fluency. And so how can we help learners to speak more easily, faster, without having to think and pause and hesitate. So fluency in that sense. For most of this webinar, we will be focusing on language, but towards the end, I want to look at this this other aspect of the process of developing fluency as well. Just to start thinking about the language we use when we speak, or language we use in conversation, I'd like to look with you at a simple example, a simple situation, where we might commonly want to have a conversation in English, or where in a classroom we might want learners to practice English. And this is the situation. You invite someone to your home and you explain how to get there. Let's just think about this for a bit. Think about what language might you need in order to have this conversation as the speaker, and what about the other person? I'll just pause for a moment here, and by all means give any contributions you'd like as you think about it. Okay, well, clearly there's the whole range of language you might need in order to engage in this conversation. You'd need grammar of various kinds, various grammatical structures. You'd need a certain amount of vocabulary. Especially though, I think you would need functional expressions. For example, the language for making an invitation, for inviting, such as would you like to come round? Are you free to come round? Are you free to visit me? And so on. Also the language for accepting and refusing. Yes, I'd love to. Oh, no, sorry, I can't. Also asking for information. How do I get there? What time shall I come? Is there a bus? And so on. And possibly the language of giving directions as well. Take the number 15 bus, go out of the station, my house is near the supermarket, turn right, turn left, and so on. And also probably the language of arranging to meet. So I'll see you at 6, I'll see you later, and so on. If we put all this together, then this might lead to a conversation something like this, which I'll just read to you. Would you like to come round for lunch? Thanks, I'd love to. How do I get to your house? Take the number 15 bus to Park Street. My house is just near the bus stop. Okay, I'll see you at 6. Yes, see you then. If we look at this conversation, it's the speakers, they get across what they need to say, but if I look at it, it doesn't look to me like a very natural conversation such as we'd have in real life. It looks actually a bit like a typical course book conversation, but not much like the kind of conversation I would probably have if I were talking about this. So let's just look at this and consider in what way is it different from a real life conversation? Or what is missing from the conversation that might be there in real life? Just take a minute to think about this. I think there's a bit of a delay in the chat responses because some of the responses are still coming in from the last part of this. So I'll just go on and show you here is my version of how this conversation might be, I think, in real life, if I was really having this conversation. And you can see from this that these functional expressions are still there. They're there in black. Somebody has just put lacks natural chatter, which I think is a very good comment. And what I put in red is some of this natural chatter and hesitation and ums and ers, which mark out the way we have conversations in real life. If you look at the expressions in red, these add into the conversation what we often refer to as speaking strategies. So just reading through this, A starts off not with just would you like to come round for lunch, but with a way of introducing, leading into the topic. Oh, by the way, yes, I was meaning to ask you, to link this to what was going on before or what the situation was. Then B, are you sure? It's very nice of you. Responding with emotion in some way, expressing surprise, maybe pleased. Of course. Okay, great. Hesitating, giving yourself time to think about what your response is. Well, let me see. Then take the number 15 bus to Park Street, and then B, checks and clarifies what A says, and B, corrects him. No, not 50, it's 15. So what we're adding in here, and what I think would naturally happen in this conversation, are these speaking strategies, and these are examples of them. We had introducing the topic, oh, by the way, responding positively, or perhaps with surprise, giving yourself time to think, and I think very importantly as well, communicating to the other person that you are thinking about your answer, clarifying, and correcting. These are just some examples of speaking strategies which would be included in a conversation like this. Of course, there might be many other strategies the speakers might use. Let's just look at some other examples of situations where people use speaking strategies of this kind. Here's one example. Look, I'm not sure how to put this. What is it? Well, the company has got to make cuts. So probably the situation here, this is a boss talking to an employee, and the boss is about to say, you're fired, you're being made redundant. Why does the boss use these expressions in red? What is the strategy that A is using here, do you think? Okay. Right, so we've got some responses here that he's making it sound more empathetic, he's hesitating, he's preparing the other speaker, he's got an unpleasant situation to talk about, he's softening the situation. We often call this softening language. Thank you for these responses. This is softening or a careful lead into what he has to say. Rather than just going straight into what the person, what the news is that he's got to contribute. How about this situation? This is somebody probably showing some new technology to somebody, maybe on a computer, maybe a machine. So you press this button, okay, this button here. What strategy is this in red? Okay, asking for clarification. Thank you, Sandy. Checking, clarification, checking understanding. Yeah, this is an example then of clarifying language. Both A is clarifying that B is understood, and B is also clarifying that he or she has understood to make sure she's got the message. And here's a third situation. Well, anyway, you might imagine these are two people having a conversation, maybe just chatting, maybe chatting with your neighbor. And at some point in the conversation, A says, well, anyway, what do you think is going on here? Okay, David suggests change of subject. Kira, hesitation, this is jumping around a bit. Rounding off a topic, giving time to think again, getting back to the point, wrapping up the topic, conclusion. Maybe Carla, yeah, maybe ignoring what the other person is saying. This depends, doesn't it, on the stage of the conversation. Maybe if this is towards the end of the conversation, this will be a way of finishing off the topic. This person might be saying, well, anyway, I must go now. Very nice talking to you. It might be a way of moving on to a new topic. Okay, well, anyway, that reminds me, and then going on to something else. And it might also be a way of going back to the topic. They've drifted off the topic, and then A says, well, anyway, as I was saying. So all these are possibilities depending on the situation. And well, anyway is clearly a very useful expression in conversation. It seems clear to me that the strategies and the expressions of this kind are extremely important, and they're very important at all levels of learning as well. Very often people talk about the importance of speaking strategies with regard to advanced learning, for example in business negotiations or in academic discussion. And of course this is very important, but equally important are conversational strategies which are used even at beginner level. And here are some examples of very important ones, it seems to me. Excuse me, attracting attention, maybe interrupting someone. I'm not quite sure, giving an uncertain response to somebody. Well, which might be used in all kinds of situations, possibly softening, preparing somebody for what you're going to say. Again, maybe expressing uncertainty, giving yourself time to think, as Dinara's just said. And just a minute, again, this is probably giving yourself time to think or perhaps interrupting somebody. So these are important strategies, but they involve extremely basic language. Of course, also important are strategies at a much more advanced level, which will be much more elaborated. And so here are some examples of those. Well, what we're going to talk about today is a way of introducing a topic, probably in public speaking, giving a presentation. I'm not sure I entirely agree with you. A way of disagreeing carefully, disagreeing politely, And look, the point I'm trying to make is reinforcing your point of view, maybe returning to the topic. So we can see here the similar kinds of speaking strategy operating both at a very elementary level and also at a much more advanced level. And the reason I think these are important is because this kind of language oils the wheels of conversation. It helps us to speak fluently. And perhaps even more important than that, it enables us to have successful communication with other people. So if these are an important part of conversation, then clearly it's important to help learners with these, to teach this language or to point this language out to learners and help them to use it. So I want to move on now to looking at some ways in which we might teach speaking strategies. And I think there are three main elements to this, or I suppose you could think of these as kind of three stages in doing this. One is simply getting learners to notice the language of conversational strategies. And I think this is important because very often this language is not central to what we're saying. And so it can easily be missed, or it can seem to learners to be unessential in some ways. And as we've seen, it is important, but learners may not notice it's there. So quite a lot can be done simply by alerting learners to the fact that these phrases are being used, which they can then pick up on. I think another very important element in this is practice, and I think this is a question mainly of automaticity, of helping learners to use these phrases and expressions and words automatically without having to think too much about them, and to make them part of their repertoire of productive speaking. And a third element in this is helping learners to use these expressions when they speak fluently, when they speak more freely. And this is a question, I think, of incorporating, of integrating these expressions into freer language use. I'm going to have a look at just some quick examples of each of these stages. So if we look at noticing first, this is a fairly easy thing to do. I think one easy way to do this is simply to take a dialogue, such as this one, and students either underline particular expressions or they complete gaps in these expressions. And sometimes, increasingly, I would say that course books include exercises like this. But if they don't, it's also something you can do almost with any dialogue, with any ELT dialogue. And this is an example. This is adapted slightly from a course book dialogue. And as you can see from the blue highlighted expressions, the focus of this dialogue wasn't on speaking strategies, the focus was on grammar and these grammatical structures for making comparisons using good, better and best. So it had a grammar focus, but if you look at the dialogue, you can also see this includes some quite interesting speaking strategies language. Just take a moment to look at this dialogue. They're comparing different TV programs, as you can see. What speaking strategies do you think they're using here, apart from the main language of comparing? What else are they doing here? Okay, they're agreeing, they're repeating a bit, showing interest, opinions, disagreeing. Yeah, I agree. I think probably more than just interest, they're expressing very strong disagreement, aren't they? And they are, yes, they're exclamations. They're expressing surprise, I think, at the other person's point of view. So it's kind of shocked disagreement here. You could imagine in a class, you could very easily focus on this aspect of the conversation. I mean, possibly after you've looked at the grammar of it, you could then simply gap out the key expressions which are used for disagreeing and expressing surprise. So maybe you can remember, or you can guess, what these expressions were and see if you can do this yourself. Okay, these are the expressions. So you can see that by doing this, this is quite a good way to focus on the language of disagreement, of strong disagreement that the learners use. Very often when we are using speaking strategies, they are concerned with turn taking in conversations and the way we respond to other people. And a slightly different technique, another way of focusing on this, is to show a conversation line by line, or to play a conversation, pausing it, and ask learners to predict what is going to happen next. So I'd just like to show you this now. Here's an example. Here's a conversation between a telephone conversation between two people. A says hello, B says Jane, it's Peter here. What do you think Jane might say next? How are you? Hi, Peter. Okay. This is indeed exactly what she says. What do you think Peter might say next? Okay, I'm fine. Fine, thanks. Okay, well, you might say why he's calling. Might say, what about you? Okay, I want to ask you for a date. In fact, this is what he says. Well, I'm a bit stressed. So what do you think Jane might say next? Okay, why? How come? Oh dear. Might be an expression of sympathy, might be asking why, might be what's the matter. In fact, she's not so interested as that. She just says, really. Well, listen, let's meet up tonight. What do you think Peter's going to say next to that? Okay, sure, with pleasure. I'm too stressed. Great. Not tonight. Okay, there's all kinds of things you could say. This is what he actually says. No, I can't go out tonight. I've got lots of work. Okay, so I think you can see how this works. Obviously, it doesn't matter what he actually says. What is important here is to think about what he might say, and you could play around with different possibilities, different ways of responding and taking turns in the conversation, focusing on different kinds of speaking strategies. What we've got here is surprise, we've got sympathy perhaps, we've got agreement and refusal, and so on. Let's look now at practice. These are ideas then just for focusing on the language, for getting learners to notice it. In doing practice, I think it's extremely important to give very quick focus practice, which can help learners to really get their kind of tongues round, get their heads round, if you like, particular expressions they're learning, and take ownership of them and make them their own. Here's an example. This is an area that you might want to practice of responding with different degrees of interest or surprise or sympathy or pleasure. And one way in which you could do very quick practice of these is by setting up what I've called mini conversations or mini situations. So for example, A and B could have sentences, could have utterances, which they say, which are announcing news, and the other person could respond using this language, just going back to that. So for example, A could say they've discovered life on Mars. Wow, that's great news. Or, really, that's interesting. Someone's just stolen my iPhone. Oh no, that's awful. I've decided to get married. Really, that's amazing. Wow, that's great news, and so on. So quick two-line conversations, which would give very intensive practice. And somebody has mentioned intonation is important here, and this would be a very good chance to focus on the intonation of showing surprise, showing sympathy, and so on. I agree. Thank you for that comment, David. So that would be an idea for very quick practice, which I think is an important stage in learners being able to use this language naturally and without having to think a lot about it. Let's look now at how we might actually use these expressions that we're teaching learners and get them to use them when they're having a more extended conversation in freer practice or when they're developing fluency. Now I'd like to look at an example of this. I'd like you to imagine now you have been teaching this language, so you've looked at it, you've got students to notice it, you've done a bit of quick practice on it probably, you may have had some exercises on it, and the language you're teaching is the language of polite disagreement at a more advanced level. This might be B2 perhaps, upper intermediate, and these are the range of expressions that you've taught and practiced. What you now want to do is to have a freer activity, and so you get your learners to have a discussion about an issue, and you want them to agree or disagree politely and express their opinions. What do you think might be a problem with doing this? What do you think might not work out well in moving into such a fluency activity? Okay, David suggested it's artificial. Okay, there's no context. Well, in this example, I think it would be important, of course, in a real class to set up a context. I think I agree with Sandy here that they might not use this language correctly, and also, as Olga says, they might be shy, or they might not have enough to go on. I think one obvious problem is that they simply might not use this language we've been practicing at all. I think this is generally a problem with free activities, that on the one hand, we want learners to be engaged and to talk about a topic and to be interested in content, but on the other hand, we want them to practice the language we've taught them. And I think it often happens that when it comes in the heat of the moment, if they really get involved in a discussion, which is what we want, they aren't actually going to think about these expressions and use them. And so here are some ideas, I think, which might be ways of making sure or helping them to actually incorporate the language we just looked at, the expressions we looked at, into a conversation. One, I think, is the principle of less is more. In other words, I think if we give learners a very large number of expressions that we want them to use freely, they are less likely to use them successfully. So perhaps it might be better, rather than trying to teach people 15 different ways of agreeing or disagreeing, to just give people maybe just 3 or 4 ways of agreeing or disagreeing, which they can more easily retain. And I think another important principle is to empower the students, in other words, to give them ownership of the expressions we're teaching and let them choose. So if we just go back to the expressions that we want them to use, before they have a discussion, they could look at these expressions and just put a tick or a cross or a circle beside just 1 or 2 or 3 that they want to use. And I think this would make it more likely that they would actually incorporate these expressions into their conversation. Another important principle, I think, is to get feedback after the conversation. So allow the learners to speak freely during the conversation, but then afterwards maybe return to these expressions. As a teacher, you would monitor the conversation, but then ask them, well, which expressions did you use? Which didn't you use? Which did you find easy to use? And to focus again on the language. And another idea is perhaps to make this into a kind of game. I know teachers who often do this, that the learners have the expressions we want them to use in front of them, and they tick an expression when they use it. And so maybe we give them a point every time they use an expression, so it becomes a kind of game. And another idea is to use an observer. So instead of just having a discussion, you could have a group of learners. Three of the learners are having a discussion, and the 4th learner is observing. And the 4th learner's job is simply to note down what expressions came up and then report back to the teacher. So these are ways of, I think, allowing fluency activities to take place, but at the same time helping learners to integrate conversational strategies into them. So at the beginning of this webinar, I talked about two ways in which we might help to develop fluency and develop speaking skills. One is by introducing the language that learners need for the fluency activity, and this is really what we've been looking at so far. And a second way, which I wanted to look at, was the actual process of developing fluency and helping learners to simply speak more easily and more freely. And I think this is partly a question of giving preparation time. And I want now to move on to that and have a look at some examples of how we might help learners to prepare for speaking. And here's an example. Before I talk about that, just imagine a situation here that you want to have a discussion about privacy, and you want learners to talk about whether they have a sense of privacy or not, whether privacy is important to them. Whether they need personal space, or whether they like to spend a lot of time with other people. I think this is quite an interesting topic to talk about, but I would be concerned, as we saw with the earlier example, that learners might just dry up. They might feel they might not have anything to say about it, or some learners might talk about it, but others might not. And I think one way in which we could help with this would be to introduce a preparation phase. So before they have this conversation, to have a thinking time. So you might just have this question, well, how important is privacy to you? How important do you need personal space? And just mark your place on this line. Okay, I see some of you are doing this. Some of you are 3 and 4, some are 2, some are 5. Okay, some are 4. I think my place would be about 4.5. I'm a fairly private person. I don't like to share tables with strangers in restaurants, for example. I like to go for walks on my own, so things like this. So I might just think about this and mark my number, and perhaps just think about why I've put my number just there. And then learners could do that, and then we could ask them then to talk to another student just to show them where they've put themselves on the line. Also say where they put themselves on the line and see if they put themselves in the same place. And I think because we're given this thinking time, there's more chance that learners would be able to talk freely and fluently about this. So the basic principle here is, I think and then speak, rather than just go straight into speaking. I'd like to show you one more example of a similar thing. This is an activity actually from Cambridge English in Power, which Alistair mentioned at the beginning. And this is again a fluency activity based on a picture. If you look at this building, we might get our learners to talk about the building and what it is, why it's there, what it's used for, and so on. Again, I think this is quite an interesting thing to talk about, but the risk is that some learners would find it easy to talk about it. Other learners might not quite know what to say about it, or not be able to talk very fluently about it, or perhaps even not have developed very clear ideas about it. And again, I think we can greatly help with an activity like this by introducing a preparation time, which is simply thinking time. And I'd just like to show this to you. You don't need to respond to this particularly, but just look at the picture and just think about it to yourself. Like, what is this? Is it a house, or is it some other building? Where is it? Is this a river or a sea or a lake? What country might it be? And why do you think this house is there? What do you think it's used for? Why was it built like this? Does somebody live here or not, or use it for something else? And then you just might imagine just going into this house and imagine what it's like. Like, are there rooms there, or is it just one room? And what you see in it is the furniture, are there things on the walls? Is there something on the floor? Are there perhaps people or objects? And finally, what kind of atmosphere does it seem to you to have? Is it a place you'd like to stay? Would you like to stay the night here, for example, or not? Why? So these are all things, okay, a lot of you are responding with your thoughts about this, okay, and these are the kind of thoughts that also might go through learners' minds, possibly making a few notes, but probably just thinking about it. And then again, as in the previous activity, learners could then form pairs or groups, and they could just see if they had the same idea. So once again, it's a two-phase activity: think and then talk. And because of this thinking time, I would expect that learners would have a much more developed idea and be much more prepared and probably more motivated as well to talk about this. So this might also help the process of fluency. So just to pull together the things we've talked about here, really, in a way, we've been talking about different kinds of preparation for fluency activities. We talked in the first part of this webinar about language preparation, really, and about the language you need in order to speak. And we saw that this included functional language, which of course is very important, and which is usually very well covered, but also the language of speaking strategies, which is less well known and so therefore worth focusing on perhaps a little bit more. And then in the last part of this talk, we looked at what you might call psychological preparation, so giving thinking time before doing a fluency activity. Some of the examples that we looked at, especially the last one, come from, as I mentioned, Cambridge English Empower, which is a new adult course from Cambridge at 6 levels from A1 to C1. And in particular, the idea of developing speaking strategies is a very important part of this course at all levels from A1 onwards. And that brings us to the end of this webinar, in fact. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you also for all your very good contributions. I apologize at the beginning I was looking at the top rather than the bottom of the list of contributions, so I didn't catch them at the beginning, but I saw them later on. So thank you very much for joining in, those of you who did, and for listening, the other people who didn't add comments. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Adrian. And we've already got quite a few questions, and hopefully we'll get a lot more in the next few minutes. But so first question, I had a few people asking actually about context and the importance of context in sort of choosing which utterance, which particular type of response to make. How do you teach students to judge the context, or how do you bring in context as a factor?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, a very important point generally. The examples I was showing, they were pretty much out of context, of course, because we were just looking at the language and considering what the context might be to some extent. But I think in teaching conversational strategies, context is extremely important. In fact, especially with language such as these, for example, softening language, for leading, saying things politely, bringing bad news carefully, like this example we looked at. It's extremely important for learners to know when this is appropriate and what kind of situations this might be appropriate in. This also applies, though, to almost any kind of conversational strategies. So I think it would be extremely important to provide a very rich context, in fact. At the very least, a fairly full and natural dialogue or conversation, which shows very clearly a situation. I would also, as a teacher, look at what the situation is and look at who is speaking, what the relationship between the speakers are. What they want, what the other speaker wants, how they feel about things, all the elements of the situation. Ideally, I think context is actually better shown through video than through audio, because I think there's an awful lot of information which can be conveyed by body language and by seeing what the people are doing and seeing the situation. So yes, my answer is yes, context is extremely important. And I don't think you can really use conversational strategies without knowing something about the relationship between the speakers. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Why they're using formal language or less formal language.
Thank you. Ancient question now from David Howe, who says, should we tell students which forms we'd like them to use in their speaking in advance of the discussion? Should we go for truly free speaking, Or can students really convey meaning if they're focusing on the form and using particular forms?
Yeah, okay, that's a very interesting question. I think, I mean, this picks up on what I was showing you with the discussion where I showed you these expressions for careful disagreement and then suggested a possible discussion activity. I think this is exactly the issue. And I think if we want learners to discuss a topic, and I agree again with what you said, some of you, that it would be very important to provide a good context for this and prepare for the topic. If we want learners to engage in a free discussion, I think it's important that during the discussion they're focused on meaning and they're saying what they want to say and they're involved in the activity. And I think all of us as teachers think it's, well, the ideal is if learners almost forget that they're in an English class and get so involved in a discussion that they forget that it's language practice. So I think it's really important that fluency should be a fluency activity and we shouldn't interrupt it more than necessary by reminding them of language. But I think the way of bringing in the language we want to teach is to do this before the discussion and after the discussion. Because of course this is important. I mean, we don't want them just to have a fluency activity and simply ignore the language we've been trying to teach them.
Yeah.
But I think it's a question of language preparation and then I think feedback afterwards where you can return to the language.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Ilona Belchikova, who says, can you recommend any resources with pictures for developing speaking for fluency, sort of inspiring pictures?
Well, I mean, one at the risk of recommending my own material, in Cambridge English in Power, which is this book that I've been involved in writing, in fact, this is exactly what we try to do, is to have interesting and inspiring pictures at the beginning of every unit, which lend themselves to fluency activity, such as the picture that I showed you of the house by the sea. Yeah, I think it's extremely important actually to use pictures which make people think and ask questions and wonder about things. I think it very often happens in teaching materials that texts are often interesting, recordings are often quite interesting, but pictures are often very bland. Very often they're just very typical middle-class families having dinner together, and they're pictures where there's nothing very much to say about them. So I think it's extremely important to have pictures which have a bit more edge to them, which actually make you wonder what's going on. And those are the kind of pictures I would always try to use. But one resource for that is Cambridge English in Power. Yeah.
Yes, I think I'll put a link in the chat about a competition we're running using some images from Power. I'll put that in a moment. Question from Surya Nimagada, who asks what your thoughts are on using technology in improving speaking skills.
I'm not quite sure what kind of technology she has.
Are there any particular
one obvious kind of technology I think is links back to what I was saying before, is using video, I think, rather than audio, in order to show a very clear situation. But maybe she had something else in mind.
Okay, I'll see if we get another comment on that in the chat. A question from Christine Sator-Chandley, who says, what about when students have very little imagination? How do you actually get them then to work on their fluency and speaking?
Well, I think this is a very difficult question. I think there are classes where some students are simply, they don't have things to say. And I think my only answer to this is it comes back to the ways in which we prepare for the fluency. And I think the more that we can prepare, and the more we can provide contexts, and the more we can provide this kind of thinking time and preparation time, the more chance we give, perhaps, for students to develop their imagination. I mean, I hope I showed with this example with the house that I think if you come to this out of the blue, it might just draw a blank with a student. But I think if you ask a student to kind of actually think about it for a few minutes, then there's more chance that ideas will come to them. Of course, it's not guaranteed.
Okay, thanks. Question from Valentina Matukina, who says, how do we encourage shy students to speak in class?
Well, I think again, I mean, the more we can give preparation, the less students will be threatened by what they have to say. Um, and I think if we go back to this example I showed with the scale, where you mark your position on it, this is a technique I've used quite often in class with different personal topics. I think personal topics are very interesting to talk about. For example, privacy and whether you're a kind of private person or not. It's interesting. It is personal, but because it's personal, it can be threatening as well. So I think this is a typical topic where shy students might be reluctant to say something. And I think by giving a very clear task before the speaking, where you have this very physical line, and you actually all you have to do really is put your position on the line. I think this is perhaps one way of helping overcome this kind of, well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to say anything about it. And maybe you do this, then all you really have to do is show your position on the line. Then I compare it with somebody else. And perhaps this is a way in to reducing shyness, especially with more personal topics.
Thanks. Would that apply also for students who get particularly stressed when speaking a foreign language? Do you have any particular tips on how to relax them, put them at their ease, or was that really covered by what you were just saying?
I think partly, yes. I mean, I think the other thing, which I think is fairly obvious, I think, is in fluency activities. I mean, certainly to use pair and group work so that conversations are taking place in private. If, as a teacher, you're monitoring pair and group work, to do it in a very hands-off way, especially during fluency activities. I mean, maybe just to kind of listen and maybe notice what people are saying, but I think certainly not to kind of interrupt, and certainly not to correct people, because I think this is a very good way of making shy students absolutely silent.
Absolutely, yes.
So I think those would be the ways that I would suggest. So students get used to the idea that they can speak in private, in pairs and groups, without anybody correcting them necessarily, and that's not the point.
Thanks. Question from
David Howes mentioned here positive reinforcement, which I think is thank you, David. I think that's also a very good point. I mean, the opposite of correcting mistakes is to give positive. I mean, to be encouraging, to say yes, that was fantastic, and I think this also helps as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, a question now from Efrosini Zunio, who says, at higher levels, how can we make students activate and recycle the advanced vocabulary that they've learnt in speaking activities?
Sorry, could you? I missed the question.
I got the emphasis wrong there as well, actually. So
I was looking at the comments. Okay, could we hear the question again?
So yes, at higher levels, how can we make learners activate and recycle the advanced vocabulary they've learnt in their speaking activities? How do we get them to use in their speaking activities this advanced vocabulary they've picked up?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Because it's quite a broad question. I mean, I suppose by giving learners several different kinds of activity, which would use the same vocabulary. I think what I notice sometimes in teaching materials and lesson plans is that teachers introduce vocabulary, and then you maybe do an exercise on it, and then you just have something free, some free activity. And I think probably that doesn't quite hack it. That's probably not quite enough. And I think the problem is whether learners really transfer and integrate what they've learnt into the speaking activity. So I think probably more different kinds of practice, more different kinds of activation are necessary to get learners to really start using the vocabulary.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Christine Sutro-Chandley, who asks how you'd go about teaching nuance, particularly. I guess the different nuances around some of the vocabulary that you would and items that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I'm not sure I know how to teach it exactly. I think my approach to teaching it would be to talk about it, to elicit it. For example, when I showed this example of predicting what's going to happen next in a conversation, I think this is an extremely good way to focus on nuance. Thinking of a conversational context, of course. What's the difference between saying sort of, oh great, oh amazing, oh really, or oh dear, or and so on. These, there's a kind of there are subtle shades of difference between different kinds of responses, and I think the way to focus on it is is simply to talk about it, to ask students to try to develop a sense of it. So I'm not sure as I would see it as teaching it, more as perhaps looking at it and talking about it, if that answers the question.
Great, thanks. Question from Michaela Bartasova, who asks whether you think it's worth students recording themselves when they're practicing their speaking, so they can sort of listen back and sort of learn from that.
I think it's an excellent idea, as long as there is time to do it, because it may take time, and as long as it doesn't put students off. I think this links back to some of these questions about shyness and inhibition, and learners being reluctant to speak. I think if you have developed a sort of confidence in the class where learners are very happy to have a go and listen to themselves, I think it's an extremely powerful technique and very, very good indeed. But I would treat it with caution because of that. A lot of people don't like hearing themselves.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But they get used to it. So.
Yes, I always hate when I listen to the recordings of these webinars and hear myself introducing people.
Yep.
It's deeply painful. Anyway, so a question now about how to find topics to engage learners to speak. You mentioned earlier, I think, about finding out what actually your learners were interested in, and sort of working from that. But do you have any other suggestions of topics that can get learners to speak? Or where to find these topics?
Yes. Yes, I think this is a very difficult question. I'm answering this in a way as a materials writer, as a course book writer, and of course this is something that engages us continually. Is what topics are going to be interesting, and I think in this respect, course books are often at an enormous disadvantage. Because they tend to go for topics we think are going to be interesting to a very, very wide range of people. I think this is important to use topics like that, but I think it's also important to add to that topics which are topical, which are relevant to students' everyday lives, and which are things which are, especially these days, which you can find on the internet, on YouTube, things which are in a way of temporary interest. So I think that's one source that I would find. I also think that very often there is no such thing as an interesting topic and a not interesting topic. I think to a large degree it's a question of how you deal with that topic and what kind of tasks, what kind of activities you introduce as well. So I'm not sure that I necessarily think, well, there are certain topics that nobody will ever want to talk about, because I think there are ways we can make them interesting by getting students to guess things, by using pictures, by leading learners into the topic. That's easier to say than to do. I know that.
Yeah, thanks. Question from Daniel Levy, who says, do you see accuracy feeding into fluency or the other way around?
Ooh, yes, interesting question. Yes, I see it as I don't think it's a process of just going kind of presentation and then practice and accuracy, and then automatically learners will then use that language in fluency. I think this is an idea which is really no longer considered to be valid. I think I would see it as going around in circles, perhaps. So I think certainly accuracy does feed into fluency. I think if we give this kind of very intensive practice of the expressions I was talking about, for example, this quick question and answer, I think this helps to make language automatic. So it helps with automaticity. And I think this then feeds into fluency. I've noticed this myself as a language learner of German, that when I start using new expressions, the more I use them, the more automatic they become. And then I find no problem with using them when I'm speaking fluently. So I see that as one process, but I think but complementing that process, I think it goes the other way around as well. So I think it's very useful and very important to allow learners to use language fluently, and then afterwards to look at the language they learned, which is what I was suggesting with this idea of feedback after fluency activities. Yeah.
It's a question now from Maria de la Iglesia Meta, who says, how good or bad is it to ask students to speak about something before you've presented the language to them?
I would think it's not at all bad, and actually very good. For various reasons. I think for one thing, it can tell you as a teacher what they know and what they don't know, if I understand the question correctly. So, for example, I might be interested in introducing a grammar point. It seems to me it might be quite useful to get learners to speak, to give a fluency activity where learners may or may not use the language I'm going to teach, and to see from that what they know and what they don't know would give me quite valuable information. I can't think of any reason not to do this, except perhaps for absolute beginners, where of course it would be very difficult for them to do that. But beyond that very beginner level, I think it's a good idea.
Okay, thanks. Question from David. We've talked a lot about conversations. Do you have any particular thoughts on more formal presentations in class? David says he's found that the feedback from those can be quite challenging because other students get very critical.
Yes. Well, I think from the point of view of speaking strategies, which we were looking at, yes, a lot of what we were looking at was in two-way conversations, but of course equally important, and especially at higher levels, is what you might call more monologue strategies, such as staging a presentation, indicating, you're starting off or finishing, making presentations coherent, and so on. On the question of feedback, I'm not sure I'm quite clear what's behind the question that learners are too critical in their feedback.
Yes, I think possibly that learners, the rest of the learners are looking perhaps particularly for errors when it's they're just focusing on one person speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this answers the question or not, but I think in general, when learners are speaking publicly, which might be reporting back on an activity, for example, or might be giving some kind of presentation, it would be very important for the listeners, the learners listening, to be directed towards the content of what the person is saying, not to be listening out for language.
Yeah.
Because this is what if the person is communicating, then that's the important thing, isn't it? So I don't know if this is what's behind the question, is possibly asking learners to kind of spot sort of whether the language is good or not. I think this is something. I mean, it's a bit like recording your voice. It's something that would be quite useful given an atmosphere of uninhibited atmosphere, an atmosphere of trust maybe. But I think it's something to be very cautious of if it might put students off.
Okay, thanks. Question from Abdus Salam Qureshi, who wonders how any of this might apply to teaching in a flipped classroom model. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I'm sorry, could you have the...
Sorry. Abdus wondered whether you had any particular thoughts on sort of taking these approaches, the approaches you've been suggesting in a flipped classroom model.
I'm not sure. I'm afraid I don't quite understand what he means by flipped classroom. Actually, I'm sorry, it's not terminology I'm familiar with.
So where
probably I can't answer the question.
Okay, I mean by the flipped classroom, we're thinking particularly of where sort of the what would traditionally be the homework gets done in class, and the classroom activity. So I guess that would mean that you do the grammar elements, for instance, and the material that you're notionally learning in preparation for the class, and then you'd focus the classroom activity primarily on conversation.
Yes, I see. Okay. Yeah, I think probably on. I mean, yeah, because I'm not entirely familiar with the idea of this. I think probably it would be unwise for me to try to answer it, actually.
Okay, no problem. Question from Christine Sutter Chandley, who asks, what do you do when the teachers don't, when as a teacher, you can't really understand what the student said. Obviously, you don't want to sort of leap in and if you're trying not to leap in
Hello?
and correct because you'll inhibit students, then having to explain that you didn't understand them could be equally problematic.
Yes, I assume this is talking about, say, reporting back on an activity or feedback
Yeah.
after an activity. Um, yeah, um, yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's a situation I've often found myself in. Uh, uh, um, I think up to a point, I mean, the only way to deal with this is the same way as you deal with this in real life. That if you don't understand someone, probably you apply a mixture of um, trying to get the general idea without having to keep asking them to repeat,
Yeah.
or if it's necessary, ask them to say it again, but in the nicest way possible. I mean, I'm not sure it's a
Absolutely.
satisfactory answer to the question, but I can't think of any other option in a way.
No.
Um, it's clearly very important not to make learners want to shut up because they're not being understood.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
thank
I
you
mean,
very much, Adrian. I'm afraid that's all we've got
yeah.
time for today. But before we go, I'd just like to tell everyone about next week's webinar. On Tuesday, June the 30th, Kay Bentley will be joining us to explore two key questions. What is content teaching, and why is content teaching important for young learners? She'll be providing examples of effective content and language teaching, particularly in primary ELT contexts, as well as ideas for delivering stimulating content input. And we'll be sharing a link for you to sign up for that session in the chat in the next minute or so. And don't forget that your certificates of attendance will be sent automatically later this week, so you don't need to email me to ask about that. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, but thank you in particular to you, Adrian, for another absolutely fascinating session. It was really helpful. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everybody, and see you next week.